Welcome. Thank you all for joining me. I'm Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is my ongoing occasional podcast talking about questions in Christianity and history. And today I have a wonderful special guest who I think the best way to describe him is my Australian pen pal. that one of the best things that happens when the SJWs come after you, and that actually will feature in our meditations this evening, is you get letters from people all over the world. And John Moran wrote to me. We had a little moment trying to figure out exactly how long we've been in touch, and we figured out he wrote to me last year on August 1st, 2018, which means you must have read Milo's article about me. um, since that came out on July 31st. Was that how you found me? Do you remember?
I think it was, and it had something to do also with at the time you were in an exchange with Jordan Peterson,
Right.
and
And
it was all in that mix. And I was also looking for some assistance with some research I was doing, and I noticed you were a medieval specialist, and I saw Tolkien also on your bio, and I thought, oh, this lady sounds interesting for a range of reasons, and
yeah, so you
that's what happened.
pounced.
Yes.
You,
I
you
wasn't even
said,
sure if you'd respond, but thankfully you did. I was quite impressed because a lot of, oh, who's this stranger sort of thing, and you're busy people in universities. So I was very pleased and impressed that you took the time to respond, and it's gone from there.
well, I mean, and you got my interest because you asked me whether I had read Brad Gregory's book, The Unintended Reformation, which is, if people listening, you haven't read it yet, you need to read Brad Gregory's book because the sort of long historical arc of how we got here and what's gone wrong since the 16th century is certainly something that I've talked about a lot in my own. When people ask me why I study medieval history, it's often, well, to point to you to the sorts of things that we've lost in the intervening centuries, and one of them is the thing that we're going to be talking about today, right? Which is your understanding of prayer and the way in which as I told you when you started asking me about this, I think you've rediscovered monastic prayer in a very interesting way, and that's why I'd actually liked, we want to concentrate on that, but um, obviously other things can come up because you said when you introduced yourself, you said you've been a professional campaigner mainly for labor unions, especially women's nursing unions for the last 30 years. And I appreciate that you're in touch with me because I know politically sometimes we can seem like we're on opposite sides and then we found out we're actually not. Um,
That's
in,
right.
in our interest in sort of sharing both our faith as Christians and our concerns about the way the political conversation has been going. Just to help people know where you're coming from, you have a company called Preferential Publications, and you say, "What's your story? Perhaps we can help you tell it." Specialists in public campaigning, communications, government relations, media strategies and liaison, general writing, speech writing, editing. And I was very curious about what all that meant. Maybe you could say just a little bit about that so that we have a sense of how that feeds into your desire to help people learn to pray as well.
Well, that's the company that I've been using for since the early mid 1990s to earn a living, but also, and the work, as you described, was through basically assisting people or businesses and mainly labour unions to improve their public image, to achieve the success they want in their campaigns, and to get their message out to the general community, and to work on policies that suited them and so on. So I guess that's what got me to this. I've had, all my life has basically been working in areas of public policy, government relations, what governments do, the packages and programs that governments bring to people's lives and assisting in people's lives. And after all those decades of working in that, certain things started to become apparent to me after a while. And they go to, as you said, Professor Gregory's book about the unintended reformation. And I thought about what it meant, and it sort of all comes out of that split, if you like, between the secular government and the secular solutions to life and life's issues and the meaning of life, versus a more integrated approach that takes into account, I guess, spirituality. The word we use for it is spirituality as well. And working in the government sphere, working in the public policy sphere for so long, and you can see it. I mean, the things we talk about in terms of the current state of politics, you can see it certainly in the United States at the moment. You're probably getting more coverage around the world than anyone else because of your size and you're such a big and powerful nation. It's also happening in the United Kingdom. You can see Europe. It's also happening. This split between spiritual and secular, and it seems to me, and we can talk a bit about this, given my extensive experience in this area, that something isn't working.
Right.
And I think most people would agree with that. If you look at all the polling around, people's opinion of politicians and governments and so on around the world has basically plummeted.
Right? Yeah, that there's a real malaise in, and you're talking about the secular, in the public sphere, in our sense of what government is for, and the way in which we're able to solve our problems in community. And I like that you're setting this up. It's like we're in a spiritual crisis which affects our ability to perform secular functions like, collecting taxes or running elections.
Exactly. But on the flip side, there's also an excessive reliance on the secular sphere to solve everything.
Right.
For example, we now constantly hear all this talk about, say, mental health issues, for argument's sake, which is the big one. We need to spend more money on mental health programs, blah, blah, blah. And we've been doing that now for 30, 40, 50 years, in spite of what people might think, right? But it's not clear to me at all. It's not clear to me at all that many of them are actually working.
Do you have immediate experience with some of those programs?
Yes, I do. I for 3 years I was an advisor in Australia to the Minister for Veterans Affairs, and we're always dealing with returned servicemen and women and things like post-traumatic stress and so on, and again, we were constantly looking to put together government programs for support, and that's very important. Don't get me wrong; that they're an important part of the process. We all need human support and structural support for our issues, but the more I look at it, even now after 30 years since I was in that job, we're still talking about homeless veterans, dispossessed veterans. You sort of ask yourself, having done that all that time ago, well, how far have we got with all this?
Right. Why is it still a problem? We've been trying varieties of. This is a nice lead-in, I think, to what you're suggesting is a very simple practice, but that can help with some of these massive problems. What sorts of programs have you seen implemented that haven't really gone anywhere?
Well, they're basically mental health type support programs and psychologist support programs and counselling and all of that sort of stuff. And they're good to a point. So I want to be very clear about this. I'm not suggesting that these things aren't part of the deal. They are. But when I looked at what they were achieving, they didn't seem to be taking it to the next step. If you like to really get the healing that people require, yes, you can get through psychology, you can get the identification of the problem, and and we can sit and talk about it and work it through and so on. But it doesn't seem to take people to the next level of genuine hope and healing. And I think one of the classic examples at the moment, I think also, is this issue of, and probably talking about it from the point of view of, say, the Catholic Church and even other churches, this issue of child abuse.
Right.
The issue of trauma, right? And it's often being discussed from the point of view of secular program solutions, which are important. But I'm sort of look at some of it, certainly in Australia, and some of like people outside courtrooms yelling and screaming at people, and I'm sort of thinking, well, we need to get to a healing phase here. There needs to be a spirituality here because you can't live your life with hatred, and if you want to personally improve and personally live a reasonably contented life, you can't let all of that continue to eat you away. We need to heal, And that's just one. And and same with post-traumatic stress of any type.
So we should tell people what it is your solution is. You've written a little book that sets out a practice that you call the Resurrection Mantra. And because our exchanges got me very interested in wanting to help support your book, which is why we're talking now. There's a blurb for your book that I gave you. With the Resurrection Mantra, John Moran has resurrected and made easily accessible and understandable for everyone one of the great spiritual traditions handed down to us by early Christians. This is the use of a set phrase in times of quiet and meditation to anchor our understanding of profound and essential life truths. In this case, it is the most profound truth of all, the death to new life rhythm of life, demonstrated so emphatically in Jesus Christ's death and resurrection event, which we can easily lose sight of when we experience suffering or a setback. Would you like to unpack that a little bit for us?
Well, it takes back even before I started working in government work and everything else. So I did work for about 3 or 4 years for the church.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1980s, I was toying with vocation, and my spirituality at the time was very, very immature, and I've written about that, as you know, in the book as well, and talk about that. But one thing I did do was I was involved in a program called the Beginning Experience, and I helped set it up here in Brisbane, and it's a United States program. It's an encounter type experience, and it was designed by a nun and a laywoman in Texas for divorced and widowed Catholics. Well, not just for Catholics, but it was within the Catholic tradition. Anyone could do the weekend, and it was an emotional healing. It's an emotional healing encounter type weekend, and I have to say, I see it still going in the United States and in Australia to some extent. It doesn't seem to be as robust as it was in the 80s and 90s, but anyway, it still is going to some extent as a service within the church. But it is a very powerful program. I won't go into it too much, but it's a very powerful program, and I did a number of weekends as part of the work of getting it set up. And it was when I first encountered this notion of this death to new life. It was actually spelt out in that program. That's this concept. So that was the theoretical. That's where I first encountered it, and it gave that whole notion of the resurrection itself a whole new perspective for me at the time. And that's what triggered the next 20, 30 years of thinking about this and getting to this stage. So it is basically this, that a traumatic experience in your life is really a Calvary type experience. Now, that's been common in the church and in Christian spirituality for some time, for hundreds and hundreds of years, to talk about a trauma as carrying your cross and all of that sort of stuff. I'm not convinced it's been all that clear to people, though, that within this side of the grave concept or experience, that the resurrection is still something to be shared in, not just on this side of the grave.
Well,
right?
you give a list of things in the book people think death and resurrection, and death is death, right? And our the end of our earthly life. But you give it seems you're using this death and resurrection as a metaphor or as an analogy. That there are other things that you include in the category of deaths that you say people go through.
Yes, well, that's what through this Beginning Experience program. That's how we started to define these types of things that go wrong in our life. Although they don't even have to be big things, just even little things, minor irritations, frustrations, and so on. They're like a death experience. Something sort of dies on you in that process. Like in the Beginning Experience thing, it was very clear. A marriage had died, right?
Right.
A relationship had died, which is not a complex idea for people to understand. So they can, my marriage is over, it's dead, right? Now, in the case of a death, a widow or widower, well, that's very clear. That's self-evident that someone's died. But in a divorce situation, it wasn't always conceptualized like that for people. So when they started to think about it like that, you can say, okay, well, then you've had a death experience. Now you've got to merge through that to the Sunday, to the resurrection side of it. And I started to think about that over the next few decades and work it out in my own life, particularly recently, in a way that you start to see everything that goes wrong like that. And if you sit down and think about it in a positive way, you can actually start to see the pattern.
Right. So you give a long list of examples, like loss of an argument at work, rejection of an idea by others, being criticized by others, being ridiculed or attacked online.
Yeah, well,
Ruining your lunch, spilling your coffee, your car breaking down, an unplanned pregnancy, a speeding ticket, forgetting to put the rubbish bin out, burning your breakfast, being betrayed, being bullied, missing a career promotion, not getting all of these things where there's up to and including death of a child, death of a partner, retirement, getting older, illness or injury, marriage. But you've gone from the the sort of little things, a single argument that you lose at work, or a bigger problem, being betrayed by someone, separation or divorce, all the way up to death, so that it's all of these share a particular structure of experience that you're trying to help people understand.
yes, I think they do. And if you think about an argument at work, I mean, you've gone into a meeting with a particular expectation or an understanding or a dream about what you want to achieve. And then someone across the table has taken you on or said, no, I'm not, all of a sudden that dream, that expectation is broken on you. It's died in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that can be, if you're in, most people can relate to the fact that can be really irritating and annoying. And you can be sitting at a table feeling anger towards that person. All these sorts of the sort of emotions that we feel when someone has really died. The anger, the emotion, the depression, the upset. Right.
Well, certainly something like up to the level of promotion. I had a little bit of experience with that in the last year or so, when I was expecting a promotion for having published my second book, and it didn't come when I was expecting it to. And what I've been experiencing over the last year and a half or so it's grief, right? There's a sense of, I had this story about myself that I was living, and it's not there anymore. And that doesn't mean that the promotion isn't going to come ever, but it certainly it was a death. It's familiar to me what you're trying to, I think, show is a death of that sense of, who am I? What does my life mean? Sort of where should I put my hope and my projection? And all of those things could be broken simply by, you say things like getting older, the death of youthful energy, dreams and idealism, death of the trim, taut, terrific look of our teens and 20s, death of the clear, unwrinkled skin, death of a decent head of hair or its unblemished color, dying eyesight, dying libido, impotence and reproductive function, menopause, been there, in that, right? And you're having to let go of all of these futures that you've projected on the basis of who you had been.
So what do you do about it? This is
Right.
the challenge, isn't it? You can, in your situation now, you can become angry with the university. You can become embittered about a broken career option.
Right.
Right. And many people do. Let's be frank.
You sort of get stuck forever being angry and frustrated.
Look around you at all the people who've been through that, and how many of them react. Large numbers of people react negatively rather than positively.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I guess what I'm saying is that I think that percentage in the last 40 or 50 years has exploded exponentially. I think not all change is positive, right? People talk about, like the world's not necessarily a linear progression of positive change all the time. We've seen that through the vicious world wars. We sort of intuitively get it, but we sometimes also think that, everything that changes is good. We use the word reform when often it should be just discussion of change. A lot of change can be bad. A lot of change can be bad. And I think one of the worst changes in the last 50 years, 60 years, in the if you like, the acceleration of secularization, has been the loss of the spiritual presence in society, where people, I generally do believe, up till about the 1960s, 70s, coped better with those things.
So
in
when you're
general.
speaking,
Yeah.
I'm thinking it's like what's changed most in the last 50 years or so, but one that's my lifetime, so I can say, oh yes, it's been since the 60s. But the thing that and I'm using my own example because I think it helps me understand what practice you're trying to introduce us to. The thing that people want most is to be in control, right? And that the frustration that I feel, it's like your example of things are, to my mind, most of these are a loss of control, right? You don't win the argument. You lose your keys. You lock yourself out of the house. The car breaks down. You're bullied. Your parents leave you. Parental desertion, right? You miss the career promotion. I keep falling on that one. All of these are things that are, we want, and our social programs, our government programs, they're all promises of control. They're all promises that, you do this thing and it will be fixed. And your examples are things that we can't, they come out of the blue. They're either accidents or malicious or, simply life, your pet dies. And those are things that we have to be able to let go of thinking that we had a lock on.
But the secular world and the government world, whether it means to or not, well, I think the secular world, particularly since what we call the Enlightenment and the things that Professor Gregory talks about in his book, this sort of slow, gradual secularization, which I believe has accelerated to some extent in the last 50 years, came along with the promise that it could fix all those things.
Right.
Right? We've got this notion, people have got this idea that scientists and governments, well, this has gone wrong in my life. What's the government doing? I mean, the United States at the moment is going through that in a very live political debate about the nature of the welfare state, how it would apply in an American cultural context, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's been sort of debated and done to some extent in places like Australia and the United Kingdom and Europe. But, but it's not clear in the countries where we've done it that that things have necessarily altogether that much better. There's certainly an improved level of comfort. What the scientists and the engineers have been able to do for us is certainly improve our sort of physical comfort.
Yes.
Right.
But still the desire is for control. I mean, back to that constantly, and the anger is at not being in control. It's like, but I did all, I mean, for me, from my own, career perspective, it's like, but I did all the right things. Why did it not happen? Right. And when I start feeling myself latching onto that and wanting to just, grip it, it's because, but I did this, right? I should be in control. I took care of, and my sort of extrapolated to the culture, to the society is, and this fits with the timeline you're describing for the United States. The Great Society came in the 60s, and it was the promise of, we will beat poverty, right? We will beat all of the illnesses and weaknesses of the society, and it will all be fixed. And what we're experiencing now is nothing was fixed. Many of the programs that, I mean, I invoke Professor Gregory's book at the beginning, and his whole premise is unintended consequences of good intentions. And we've certainly seen many of those in the social programs in the United States. You provide for unwed mothers or single mothers, and instead of taking care of the few that there are, you have an explosion of broken families.
Well, even worse, because at least in the broken family scenario, at least there's life and there's hope. Where there's life, there's hope, as they say, right?
Right.
But what's really happened is we've got, and this, people aren't aware of this figure, we've now got to the point where we have almost 20% abortion rates. So
right.
what we're actually doing is holding this model together with a antenatal death rate.
Right.
That is frankly extraordinary. It's industrial.
Beyond, I mean, yes, the level of evil when one contemplates what that means, and everyone always comes up with, it goes eugenic very easily, right? Oh, but you don't want, children being born with deep birth defects and things like that. It's like, most of the abortions have nothing to do with that, right?
No, that's right.
They're not birth defects. They're not rapes. It's just choice, right? And the choice is death.
And
And
100 years ago, and I spend a lot of time, as you know, because I shared some with you, I do a lot of historical research. I write books.
Mhm.
That's another area. And I spend a lot of time in genealogical areas digging around, finding out, getting information on people that you're writing about, and so you spend a lot of time looking at births and deaths, and as part of getting your skeleton together of the information. And you can see in that work people, like thousands of people, even in the few that I've done, there's thousands of people who would not have got to birth in our modern society. These
right.
are these are pregnancies that occurred before marriage, you know what I mean? And then people
Mhm.
just went on with them. And I'm thinking, gee, you're lucky that didn't happen nowadays, because you wouldn't have got there, right?
Right. Right.
And that our society is holding this together with that high death rate. In the past, we've had other high death rates caused by war and illness, and so on. And there's a lot of infant mortality back in that research, as you know, because we didn't have
Mhm.
antibiotics and things like that. And that controlled it to some extent. Now it's controlled by human intervention, and we tend to lose sight of the fact that we're only holding this, what we have got together, with that with recourse to that deadly option, right? That we're just not having babies that are a nuisance.
I
And,
mean,
and
to think of a baby as a nuisance is just,
I
I
know
find that so
it is,
heart-wrenchingly awful.
but that's what we've got to. So we've got this sort of, as you said, these societies that we think are okay, governments, programs, and government laws that allow us to do that, and as you say, new health programs and mental health programs, and yet, as you say, let's look even at the United States. It's just astonishing to look at photographs in major United States cities with whole tent cities.
Yes.
I
There's
mean,
a small one in Chicago by one of the
right?
freeways.
It's just,
It's
I mean,
not as large as some of the ones in California, but yeah.
you sort of ask yourself
So,
after all of this,
where's
after all of
where's
that.
our hope, John? Where's our hope? You wanted to give us some hope with your exercise.
So I think that was to say, when these things happen, you're basically at a crossroads, and for most of us, and for increasing numbers of people nowadays, it's been my experience that they take the negative. They take the negative crossroads. You increasingly see, as I said, this kind of option for the simple solution, or to shout and scream into a camera about some injustice that's occurred to you,
Right.
or and they, because I don't think, like, when I look back at people like my grandmother, and that, as I said, as I've described in the book, and she lost a child, right?
Hmm.
She lost, so she didn't have an easy life, but she didn't behave like that. And I used to give it a lot of thought, years of thought about what that was, and it was because she did have this simple spirituality, right?
Hmm.
Simply prayed twice a day. She'd say in her case, it was the rosary. I think you're a great rosary fan, and that sort of, which in itself is a sort of mantra prayer, right?
Right.
Um, so you have this kind of calming spirituality that just lets you see the world as for what it is, and then get on with it. When bad things happen, you've still got to get on with it. You've got other responsibilities, and do it positively and cheerfully. And she was a positive, cheerful person, despite all the hardships that she had. And I'm sure you probably, if you think back through your own heritage, and most people look back through their own families back to that period, you can find similar sorts of people. But most people would agree they're increasingly hard to find nowadays. Um, Everyone tends to get really angry and upset about things when they go wrong. Now, I think the solution is to accept that the secular comforts and so on can only take us so far, and that we need to re-establish in a simple way some of that spiritual equilibrium that I think previous generations had in a greater volume than we've got today. And it's something I struggled with for most of my life. I couldn't get it to work, really, in my own life for most of my life, until I started to work on this in earnest about 10 years ago. And I have to say, it from my own experience, it's worked like a dream. and got me through some pretty tight spots, even as I've got older, I don't mind saying.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that you start to say, okay, I've lost, as you said, I've lost control. Something's gone wrong. But whatever happens, there's got to be something in this. There's got to be something in this at the other end. I don't necessarily know what it is. Not necessarily sure which road I'll go down, but there's got to be a good road out of this, no matter how bad it is. And that's the basic message of Easter, death and resurrection. So how do you get yourself to the point that that's just instinctive in your being, that's just instinctive in your psyche, so that you, when things do go wrong, like what happened to you, like that, you can just, even though it will upset you and that, but you can at least say, okay, well, I'll just. So I think the way to do that is through this type of mantra prayer. I think that's what people have done over this millennia.
Mm-hmm.
That they've had these simple spiritual exercises that embed the concepts in their inner selves.
Right. So I like you describe it very in good detail in your book, which there'll be a link for the book in the video, or underneath the video, that there's a body, mind, and spirit connection that you're trying to create here, and that it's important that it's all three, so that you're saying the prayer, you're saying the mantra, and you do that. You recommend it 100 times, right? So it's an actual practical number, and that you think on it. You think on the meaning of the phrase that you're working with, and that there was a lovely way you talked about how it becomes part of you, so that you're calming your mind, and what you're going from a thing that you're thinking to a thing that you're living and experiencing.
That's it. Well said. That's actually better than what I think I've said. It's not always easy to explain that. You're talking about embedding it in yourself, in a sense.
Right.
Yes. So, all right. So, physical reality is I've had a trauma. Something's gone wrong in my life. I feel stressed. My blood pressure's going up. I'm angry.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I feel like punching the wall. That's the physical situation I'm in. Psychologically, mentally, I can look at it and say, like in your case, well, I did everything right. What's gone wrong? You know what I mean?
You want to fix it. Yeah.
Right. So that's that you can conceptualize intellectually, psychologically, what the situation is, but that doesn't fix your emotions necessarily, does it?
No.
Just understanding it doesn't. And this is what I think is the problem with a lot of our mental health programs and so-called counselling and
yes, that makes sense.
And psychology in and of itself, it only takes you to the point. Well, okay, well, I know why I'm angry and upset, because I was in a battle situation in Vietnam, and and that'll and it's traumatized me, and I saw some of my friends get wounded or killed, and okay, but that's so you understand, but it doesn't kind of get you through it necessarily, but if you say, okay, as horrendous as all that was, I'm living through it at the moment. It's terrible. It's awful the way I feel. But there will be some sort of new life through it. There will be. And that's, as I said, that's the message of Easter. If you believe in Easter, you've got to believe in that. So it shouldn't be hard for Christians to see that and say, okay, no matter how bad this gets, because things couldn't get much worse, as we've described in the book, and you helped me with that. Thank you very much. We described the actual scenes on Good Friday.
Right.
Most of us don't go through anything like that.
Yes, there's a wonderful little meme, sort of photograph of Mel Gibson with what was his name? I can't remember his name, but it's from when they're filming The Passion of the Christ, and Gibson is talking to the actor who's dressed as Jesus and covered in blood and things like that. Jesus is sort of listening to the man portraying Jesus is listening to the director, and the caption is me describing my life, how bad my life is to Jesus, and it's
and Yeah,
And he's
Jesus
sort
just
of
looks
sitting
at
there listening, right? He's like about to be, dying on the cross, and you're complaining about, you're losing your job or something. He's like, yes, okay, that's interesting.
That's right, and that's so it couldn't get much. It does for some people, but for most of us, it doesn't get
It
as
doesn't
bad as
get
that.
to the level of
No,
crucifixion.
no, 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 no.
Abandonment by all of your friends, yes,
Everything.
yeah, everything.
So it's got everything. But then there's Easter Sunday, right? So we share in that, right? So that's the whole point. We share in that. But even if you aren't quite there, if you just and the exercises are written about there in the book, as you know, if you actually just sit down and write about it, take a little diary and look at some of the bad things or some of the horrendous incidents you've had in your life, and then go through the exercise of trying to see. Yes, you can. It's easy enough to see the bad aspects of it, but try and tease out where some of the good might be leading, or some of the change, the new life, the positive. Not necessarily. It's not always good, because when bad things happen, they are bad. Let's be clear about that, right?
Right.
But you can't change them, right? So what do you do with it? You can, as I said, you can take the road to bitterness and despair, or you can say, well, this has happened. You can't change it, but what am I going to do with it? How do I take it to Sunday? How do I take it from Friday to Sunday?
Right, and that's why. So I like my example, your example of one of the death event, being ridiculed or attacked online. Death, part of our privacy, self-confidence, public image, and reputation dies. It's embarrassing and upsetting. New life, some friends come to our defense, and those relationships are strengthened. We calmly and accurately defend ourselves, and our positive profile is lifted. We decide to close our social media accounts and avoid the toxicity. Well, I didn't do that, but the example of your writing to me when you did was literally an example of what you're describing here, that I had been, what Milo had written about was the way I'd been attacked by my profession, the way my good name is still to a certain extent somewhat besmirched. I hear stories about the way former students are afraid to mention that they worked with me because they're so nervous about, oh my God, you know her. But the Sunday of all of that is, I would not be having this conversation with you if I had not gone through all of that. Right? It's that practical that the and there are a number of other of us in academia have gone through this particular kind of death over the last few years, and for some it's been horrible, right? They've quit, they've lost their positions, they've considered that they just can't keep fighting, and I wish they'd been talking to you. And gotten a sense of, well, this is traumatic, this is difficult, it is a kind of death, but look at what else is coming that may not be that thing that you thought you were going to have, but is new life, and actually possibly potentially even richer than the thing that you thought you were aiming for.
It's interesting you say that, because it's reminded me of another feature of this that I've found works for me. I had a couple of very traumatic things happen to me in the last 10 years as well, right? And what happens, and you can tell me if you agree this happened to you, is that when you're in the middle of it, things, not just lost control, but even things like fear and that take over.
Mm-hmm.
And you can lose the capacity to operate. You can become,
yes, if you let the fear completely rule you, definitely.
You can lose the capacity to operate, which in itself stops you moving to Sunday. Mm. So you're talking about the people, say, who've lost their jobs. You're talking about some of your colleagues who've lost their jobs and so on. Now, that's horrendous.
It is. It's horrible.
Financially and everything. But again,
yes.
But again, unfortunately, well, you might be able to take an unfair dismissal case or whatever, you know what I mean? But still, by and large, again, it's happened. So do you stand there paralyzed with fear to the point that you can't take that step out of it and to the solution, to the next job, if you like, or to the and I've found this mantra has helped me in that situation as well. Being able to think about, being able to focus on Sunday, even though I don't necessarily know where this road's leading, the positive road. You don't necessarily have all the answers in a packaged box. But if you've got the confidence that, and it's not magic, I've got to be clear about that. This is not magic, because you are part of that working your way to Sunday, but you've got to be able to work your way there. You've got to be able to shrug off the fear, the depression, the disconsolence, right? To be able to make the positive work, positive might not be.
It sounds absolutely impossible, right? If like when you're stuck in the fear and you're stuck in the, I mean, I had the most interesting experience I had of this with just using my promotion distress as an example, right? That the day I was sat down in my chair's office a year and a half ago and said, the promotion review, we can't go through with it right now because we couldn't get the right support for it. I was trying to watch some movies just to entertain myself, relax or something. And every single one of them, didn't matter what I was watching, it turned into a horror movie, right? It would be a comedy, and there would be this moment when suddenly everything fell apart in the movie, and I couldn't stop. I couldn't watch it anymore. And it's been very hard for me, in over the last year and a half or so, to watch anything that's not. I can watch Milo, whose new show is starting this week, or I can listen to people talking, but to watch fiction and to watch these dramas, I just can't do it. And there's that this I never really understood the meaning of the word horror until I experienced this, that you are so paralyzed that the ordinary has suddenly become terrifying, horrible, right? You're totally shook. And I could easily see that people could stay stuck in that forever, right? It's like nothing means anything anymore.
Well, if you look around, Rachel, you'll see probably in all honesty, if you look closely, the vast majority of people around you, although maybe not at church and that, but in the wider world, the vast majority of people, one way or another, are stuck in that.
Yes. And you think about our entertainment world
right
now, it's like we have nothing but horror movies. I mean, the thing is, I was thinking maybe I was just tapping into, oh my goodness, it is all horrible. And it's some of the shows that my husband has been watching in the past few years. I walk into the room and someone's being, killed in this horrifically graphic special effects way. And I'm just like, how can you watch this? There's this, the culture has been just become numb to evil.
That's right. And if that show, it has a scene in it that to some extent resonates with your situation, that you're experiencing some pain in, it's even worse. If you're looking at someone getting the sack at work on TV, that's right. Probably the last thing you want to see. It's
well, I think the thing is, I think what you started with talking about how, the last 50 or so years, you've seen these efforts at, programs and helping in mental health and stuff, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. It's like what I see in those cultural products is the terror. It's Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It's what Kurt says at the end, the horror. It's like this, it's completely descended upon our civilization, and we're trapped in the nothing but the crucifix. And the thing is, the crucifixion is a horror that transforms, and we can't see that anymore. We just get stuck forever at the death.
Well, this is a good point, because that in the general media plus the cultural media that you've just described, of course, are the new myth makers, the new storytellers. And as you say, it's a very good point you make. They're telling all these kinds of stories, but not, as you say, not necessarily in a transformative way, or a way that shows people a pathway, right? So the old myths and fairy tales, and I don't mean fairy tales like children, that gave us those kind of pathways, or have been lost. And like I'm not even sure that most young people today could tell you many of the basic biblical parables and what they mean.
I know they can't because I bring it up in class, and I have very well-educated students in my courses, and they don't know what I'm talking about.
The old perennial debate has just re-erupted here in Australia. The old perennial about whether Shakespeare should be taught in schools or not,
Mm.
right, has just erupted again, as it probably does in the US every 5 or 10 years. It does all around the world. The language is too hard, blah blah blah. And but this time, what they were saying was, oh, the storylines aren't meaningful anymore.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that was the interesting bit. I mean, I can accept the argument to some extent about the language, right? Because, I mean, I think,
No, it is difficult, but I mean, it should be pleasurable to wrestle with
yeah,
and come to
yeah,
understand. But the story, so you make a very interesting point. You have a couple of appendices, one of which I helped you on,
yep,
um,
yep,
which was pointing to the fact that this use of a mantra, this use of a short prayer formula, in fact, goes back to the origins of monasticism. That we see it in John Cassian's conferences with Abbot Isaac on, Cassian and his friend Germanus have asked for what is prayer, how do we pray, and they've specifically asked Isaac for a prayer formula, and the one that he gives them is in fact what becomes the opening of the office, the monastic office. Come to my help, O God, Lord, make haste to help me, which is Deus in adiutorium meum intende Domine adjuvandum me festina, that it's the what the monks would say at the opening of every hour. But when Isaac gives it to him, it's just keep this prayer, keep this formula, say it all the time, and it becomes the sort of refrain for all of the difficulties that you find yourself in. And I explained to you when we were in correspondence that I loved that you were reintroducing this sort of practice because it's deeply traditional, and yet has been lost. But the second postscript that you had, I was interested in thinking about what you're saying right now about losing the stories. That you have a little meditation on the problem of science and the way in which people now don't necessarily think that these prayer practices are meaningful because they're trapped in this mechanical understanding of reality, and that with quantum physics, we're getting to a place where we realize we can't understand in these mechanical terms. And this is what I loved. And you're quoting Leonard Susskind to the point where the best we can do is use analogies, metaphors. And you say metaphor? So quantum physics has brought science full circle back to the world of religion and the storytelling methods of Jesus Christ and other religious figures. And just now we're getting to this place where we need the stories that bring people back to life instead of the stories that give them despair.
and the central story that does that is Easter.
Yes.
It is. In the end, let's be honest, Christianity in the end is not about morality. It's not about, basically not about morality and so on. It's about forgiveness and mercy and redemption. It's about Easter because, in effect, as we've said, the world's full of malice, mistakes, bad things happening, and so on. Lots of good things, but bad things come along, right? And I think what God sort of said, that's the central message of Easter, is basically, look, it's going to happen, but this is how it works. This is how creation works. There is a new life there is new life at the end of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you cooperate, you've got a choice though. It's not magic, as I say. It's not magic. It's not this, God must have, we used to talk in the old days, God must have a plan for you. No, it's not like that at all. Evil is evil. Let's not beat around the bush, right? If you've had injustice done to you at work and so on, that is still injustice, right? It's not God's plan. God doesn't intervene and say, I'm going to teach you a lesson, right?
Right.
Right. It is life. It's the freedom. It's what goes with living in a free world, in a free creation, right? It's the risk. It's the risk, right? But through Easter, the central revelation is that there will be new life if you choose that path, if you take the right road. And if you embed that in your being, if you take it from an intellectual exercise to a lived exercise through this mantra, right? Where you just, if you like, almost instinctively bounce off the world because you've just embedded it in yourself, which is what I think people used to do. That didn't mean they didn't grieve. It didn't mean that they didn't feel hurt and didn't get angry at times, and they didn't cry for people they'd lost, and right. But they worked their way through it, through things like the rosary, daily mass, all those sorts of regular spiritual exercises. One of the best was always, I don't think people do this much anymore. One of the best was always the Stations of the Cross. Right. Simple spiritual exercise in Catholic Christianity, the Stations of the Cross, and you're always taught that you're going to you're probably going to fall over 3 times in life at least.
Right.
You're going to have to pick yourself up again. Right. Now, I don't even think they do the Stations of the Cross in most Catholic schools anymore. So young people aren't even learning that basic message of life, that things will go wrong and you got to pick yourself up.
Right.
And keep moving.
But what I understand about, to bring us round to our beginning with history and the problem of being in the story, you said I mentioned I work on Tolkien, and that's always my touchstone, that you're finding yourself in the story and recognizing that that you are part of it. The hobbits do that. Sam and Frodo have that moment of recognizing they're in the great story of the Silmarils, even as they're sitting there on the stairs of Cirith Ungol. That what your mantra practice is doing is giving us a way to understand ourselves in the Easter story by way of this simple repetition of the phrase. Are you wanting to let people know what the phrase is?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah. It's very simple. Yeah, it's very...
Jesus, with you, I will die and rise again.
It's as simple as that.
And you suggest, using, if you have a rosary, using it with beads and saying it regularly 4 or 5 minutes a day, that will have these lifelong effects in embedding it in your understanding. And I think what we've been talking about is the way it's a simple phrase, but in fact is one of these phrases that opens the world to you if you're able to practice it. Once you
if you can do that, it won't happen overnight, right? It's a bit like running to get yourself physically fit, right? Or studying to get yourself in, repeat learning to get yourself intellectually up to speed. This will take time. You have to repeat it, and it will take time. That's why I suggest to people, and I'd love to, we need to do something, I think, about young people, get them into this habit young, so that they're not, having to try and play catch up later in life when something does go wrong. If you can get it into your being, you will find yourself instinctively bouncing off the world. It'll just come to you instantly in given situations. Rather than having to, it'll just be a part of your worldview, right? And
right.
If you know, for example, that you've got to go to a tough meeting at work that day and you're not looking forward to it and you're angry with someone, I do this. If you just, as you're walking to the meeting, if you're just saying this over and over, you might say it only 10 or 15 times. It'll refocus you.
Right.
It'll calm you down. It'll you can say, well, even if I lose the argument in the meeting today, it's not the end of the world. Something will come out of it, right? I've just got to find what will come out of it. All right. So I found it changes my whole attitude to, I don't have to go in and win the argument necessarily,
right.
In the meeting. We'll see how the meeting goes, right? Because even if I make a little mistake, it'll be all right. Something, it's not the end of the world. Something good will come out of it.
Well, I say clearly something good came out of Milo writing about me so that you wanted to talk to me.
Well, it certainly brought a whole lot of things together.
That's did.
For sure. It got me to put pen to paper as well. So that was
excellent.
It challenged me to actually stop thinking about it and write it down.
Well, I'm so glad that you did, and I'm so glad that you were able to take the time to talk us through the practice and how you came to it. And I will, I hope everybody listening to our conversation is encouraged and interested in reading your book so that they get a fuller understanding of where the practice came from and how to implement it in their own experience.
And it does give them a good, very short tips on how to do it. So it's not complicated. This is not great in-depth spirituality, right? As you say, it's 5 minutes a day.
Right.
Very simple, simple little habits. You can do it on the train going to work or the bus, right?
Right.
When you've got quiet times, just close your eyes, let it go around in your head, or do it when you go to bed at night. If you're in a stressful situation, having trouble sleeping, just get the beads. You'll find yourself asleep in 5 to 10 minutes.
Right.
Right.
Well, that's lovely. So I know you're in Australia, so it's your daytime, and I'm here in Chicago, and it's my nighttime. And it's been lovely talking with you, John. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks for all your help with it too. It's been wonderful.
My pleasure.
All the best.